Rome ruled the world for centuries with an iron fist. Legions conquered everything, and emperors commanded millions. Rome was invincible. Until 10 men decided otherwise. Hidden across continents were brutal killers who turned Rome's greatest generals into hunted men and made the empire bleed. From Hannibal literally speed-running the Alps to bring elephants to a sword fight, to dark forest ambushes so devastating that Rome needed therapy, and a ruthless warlord who made an actual emperor kneel in the dust and beg for mercy. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on 10 nightmares Rome tried to forget. Before we dive into the blood and bones, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next descent into history's darkest corners. And while you're here, tell me, where in the world are you listening from? And what hour of the night has dragged you into these brutal tales? Let's begin. It is 237 BC, and somewhere in the mountains between Spain and Italy, a 9-year-old child stands before a stone altar with blood on his palm. His father, Hamilcar Barca, towers above him like a god carved from bronze and rage. The boy is Hannibal, and he's about to make a vow that will echo across centuries. "Rome will burn," the child whispers, pressing his bleeding hand against cold stone. His father nods once, satisfied. Roman historians would later claim this oath bound Hannibal's soul to vengeance itself. Carthage had just been humiliated by Rome in their first war. They wanted payback, and this furious little boy with blood dripping from his hand, he'd become the instrument of that revenge. Before Hannibal ever saw Rome, before he ever crossed a single border, he'd already learned the most important lesson: how to unmake an empire. Now let's talk about the Alps. Picture this: 218 BC, and Hannibal decides that sensibly marching through the southern route is basically boring. Instead, he takes roughly 30,000 soldiers, 15,000 cavalry, and I kid you not, 90 war elephants across the Alps in November. 90 elephants, in the snow, and you think your commute is bad? Okay, let's get back to Hannibal crossing the Alps. Soldiers froze in blinding snowstorms, while avalanches roared down like the mountains themselves were angry. Cliffs crumbled beneath marching feet and panicked animals. Some ancient sources claim half his army died in those mountains. It was absolute carnage. And if that wasn't brutal enough, Hannibal himself paid a price. Some sources say he lost an eye to infection during the crossing. Others claim it happened later, wading through disease-ridden marshes in Italy. Either way, somewhere during those nightmare campaigns, Hannibal lost an eye. Because apparently crossing the Alps with 90 elephants in winter wasn't hardcore enough on its own. Historians genuinely still argue about which exact route Hannibal took from Gaul into Italy. The Col de la Traversette? The Little St. Bernard Pass? Nobody knows for certain, which is honestly hilarious. The greatest military genius in history. And we can't even agree on which mountain pass he used. It's like the ancient world's greatest mystery novel. Meanwhile, Rome was waiting for an attack from the south. Then a phantom army appeared from the north like they'd teleported straight out of a nightmare. The gates of Italy suddenly felt a lot less secure. Then came the battles. Trebia, Trasimene, Cannae. Say those names aloud, and even now they sound like thunder. At Trebia, in 218 BC, Hannibal pulled off one of history's most brutal ambushes. Picture it. Dawn breaks cold and grey. The river is frozen at the edges, treacherous, unpredictable. Hannibal deliberately positioned his army to look weaker than it actually was, basically dangling himself like bait. The Roman commander took the bait, ordered his men across that frozen river at sunrise. Soldiers stumbled into the water, numb from cold, their breath coming in white clouds. The mist was so thick you couldn't see anything. Then Hannibal sprung his trap. His cavalry came from behind like an avalanche, cutting off any retreat. The Romans were stuck between the water, their own lines, and Hannibal's cavalry closing in. By the time it was over, the river had turned dark, not from blood, but from the color of defeat itself. The valley fell silent. Crows circled overhead, patient and honestly quite smug, waiting for their breakfast. Trasimene came next, and it was somehow even more embarrassing for Rome. The year was 217 BC. Hannibal chose Lake Trasimene because the fog that morning was so dense you literally couldn't see your own hand. He sent a small force forward as bait. The Roman commander charged straight into the trap like an absolute genius. Then the horns sounded, and suddenly Hannibal's army materialized from the fog like angry ghosts from the underworld. 15,000 Romans died that day. Some were cut down. Others, desperate to escape, ran towards the lake and drowned trying to swim across. Bodies floated face down, silent. The mist never lifted. It just hung there like a permanent "I told you so" from the weather gods themselves. But Cannae in 216 BC was the absolutely catastrophic worst. Rome had finally thrown 80,000 soldiers at Hannibal. They were confident, angry, and convinced this would finally be their revenge tour. Hannibal had maybe 55,000 men. He was outnumbered. He didn't care. The Romans lined up in their traditional formation, rank after rank of soldiers, completely convinced it was foolproof. Hannibal sent his weaker forces to engage the Roman center while positioning his strongest cavalry on the flanks. The Romans pushed forward, thinking they were winning, thinking victory was minutes away. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Hannibal's cavalry swept in from both sides like a scythe. Suddenly, the Romans weren't advancing. They were being surrounded, completely surrounded, packed so tightly together that soldiers could barely lift their swords. 50,000 Romans died that single day, crushed in a confined space, suffocating on their own formations. The ground became so slick with blood and mud that at some point you have to wonder if the Romans just gave up and went home. It remains the bloodiest day in Roman military history. And Rome never quite forgot it. In fact, Rome got really good at therapy after this one. When the news reached Rome, mothers grabbed their children and whispered the words that would haunt generations. Hannibal at Portus. Hannibal at the gates. It wasn't just fear. It was apocalypse dressed up in Latin. Here's the wild part. Rome refused to surrender. Any other nation would have begged for peace. Rome said, "No, we're fighting this to the bitter end." And that stubborn refusal saved their empire. For 16 years, Hannibal haunted Italy like a ghost, undefeated, yet unable to win, a phantom in Rome's collective memory. Senators repeated "Hannibal ad Portus" like a curse to keep themselves awake at night. Children learned to fear his name before they learned to read. But something unexpected happened. Fear taught Rome endurance. Terror forged discipline. And somewhere in all that suffering, a young Roman soldier was watching, studying, learning everything. He was cataloging every move Hannibal made, every tactic, every brilliant strategy. This soldier's name was Scipio, and he would one day face the master himself. When Scipio finally got his command, he sailed to North Africa and drew Carthage into its final stand. On the plains of Zama in 202 BC, two geniuses faced each other across the dust. Hannibal and Scipio, mirror images of ambition and cunning, staring at each other across the field like titans meeting for the first time. The battle was brutal and mercifully swift. Carthage fell, not because Hannibal lacked brilliance, but because Rome had simply run out of blood to spill. Hannibal fled into exile, hunted across kingdoms like a man pursued by the Furies themselves, until finally, around 183 BC, He was cornered with nowhere left to run. He lifted a vial of poison to his lips. Hannibal had sworn never to submit to Rome, and he kept his word to the very end. Here's what Hannibal's story really means. Rome had beaten him militarily, yes, but they feared him still. Long after his death, they were still afraid because Hannibal had proven something that shattered Rome's mythology of invincibility. He proved that even empires can bleed, even the most powerful forces on earth can be wounded, and once you know that, you can never unknow it. And that's only the beginning. If you're still here, possibly wide awake despite our best efforts to help you sleep, you're exactly our kind of listener. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss what's still lurking in history's darkest corners. And tell us in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? Are you fighting insomnia in Illinois, or finally winding down in Wellington? We won't judge. We're right here with you. But if Hannibal was Rome's nightmare from abroad, another threat was already rising. This one came from within Rome's own ranks, from someone they had trained, someone they had trusted, a loyal ally who was about to teach Rome the true meaning of betrayal. Number 2. Arminius, Germania, the friend who betrayed Rome. It is the year 9 AD, and somewhere deep in a forest so dark it practically has its own personality, 3 Roman legions are about to have the worst day of their lives. Shields slip in the rain, the road narrows into black pines that seem to lean in like they're listening to everything. Varus, the Roman governor, is shouting orders that nobody can actually hear over the thunder and the wind that sounds genuinely furious. 20,000 soldiers, families, camp followers, the whole operation. They're all stumbling through mud so thick it's basically trying to consume their boots. They have no idea their guide has vanished. And that guide? He was supposed to be their friend. His name was Arminius, and he was about to teach Rome the most brutal lesson in their entire history. Sometimes your greatest betrayer is the one you trusted most. Here's the thing about Arminius that makes this story so incredibly twisted. He wasn't some external enemy charging over a hill with a sword raised. He was a Cherusci prince, which means he came from a Germanic tribe, but Rome grabbed him as a boy and held him hostage. This was Rome's strategy. Snatch a noble's kid, raise him Roman, and boom, you've got a built-in spy and diplomat who actually believes in your system. Arminius learned Latin like he was born to it. He wore Roman armor like it was second skin. He rose through the ranks until he actually became a Roman knight, which basically made him part of Rome's elite middle class. To everyone in the empire, he looked like a success story, a barbarian who became truly Roman, a triumph of civilization, except Arminius was absolutely burning underneath that polished exterior. Because looking Roman on the outside doesn't erase the humiliation of being a hostage. It doesn't erase knowing that your entire people were seen as less than human. That's the kind of wound that doesn't heal. It festers. When Rome sent him back to his homeland to command Germanic auxiliaries, he saw not peace or opportunity. He saw occupation. He saw chains, just dressed up in fancier clothing. And so Arminius began to plan. One of history's most devastating betrayals started forming in that brilliant, furious mind. For years, he waited. He smiled at Roman dinners. He wore Roman medals. He performed loyalty so convincingly that nobody suspected a thing. Then came his moment. Governor Varus, the absolute definition of overconfident, trusted Arminius completely. When Arminius warned him that a revolt was brewing deeper in Germania, Varus didn't hesitate. He marched his 3 legions straight into the forest to crush this supposed uprising. He brought his wife, his children, his entire camp. This wasn't a military expedition. This was a funeral procession that nobody knew was a funeral. The rain came down like the sky itself was weeping. Paths turned into rivers, wagons toppled like toys. Mules screamed as they broke their legs in the mud. Horses panicked and threw their riders. Soldiers slipped and fell into the muck. Everything spiraled into absolute chaos, and Varus kept pushing forward because turning back would mean admitting he'd been completely fooled by someone he'd trusted. Then the forest closed in. Not gradually, all at once. Arrows came from nowhere. Stones flew, horns sounded from every direction, and no direction at all. And when the mist parted for just a moment, Arminius stepped into view. His face was streaked with ash. He was wearing Germanic armor now, not Roman. He was no longer the loyal ally pretending to be Roman. He was the executioner. For 3 days, the slaughter raged in that forest. Rain fell, and it turned crimson. Blood mixed with pine needles and clay. Roman formations completely dissolved because you literally cannot hold formation when you can't see 10 feet in front of you and enemies are attacking from absolutely everywhere at once. Shields got stuck in mud that seemed alive and hungry. Swords snapped. Screams vanished under the noise of thunder and the sound of your own terror. It was absolute, catastrophic, total collapse. The Germanic warriors then did something that shocked even hardened historians. They captured Roman tribunes and centurions, the highest-ranking soldiers, and they sacrificed them alive, on wooden altars hidden among the roots of ancient trees. They hung the skulls on tree trunks like grotesque hunting trophies. Some captives were flayed, others were strangled or left in pits to starve in the dark. Varus, wounded and delirious, finally understood what was happening. He wasn't going to be paraded in chains through Germania as a trophy for Rome to ransom back. So he did the only thing left. He fell on his sword. His head was hacked off and sent to another Germanic king, Maroboduus. But Maroboduus was cautious, and he didn't want to anger Rome by keeping it. So he forwarded it to Rome for burial, like some kind of nightmare diplomat making a formal delivery. When the storms finally passed, the forest was completely silent. Nothing moved except crows circling overhead. Emperor Augustus received the news back in Rome like it was a blow to the gut. He tore his clothes and struck his head against a doorpost. He cried out with actual anguish, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." 3 entire legions completely gone. 30,000 soldiers dead in a forest because they had trusted the wrong man with their lives. Nobody dared cross the Rhine for years after that. The forest became legend, whispers, nightmares. 5 years later, when Augustus had died, his successor Germanicus led armies across that river to try and recover what was lost. They found broken eagles half buried in the mud, bones scattered in heaps like discarded furniture, skulls nailed to trees, altars still dark with ancient stains, rotting gallows standing in the rain like monuments to failure. Germanicus built a mass grave. He covered that field with earth and prayers, trying to bury not just bodies, but the shame that came with them. Rome never recovered its confidence beyond the Rhine. The empire's frontier froze right there, forever. Arminius had done something Hannibal never managed. He hadn't just defeated Rome militarily. He had made Rome afraid, terrified of an entire region. But here's what Rome didn't understand yet. The real erosion of empire doesn't come from a sword thrust in a dark forest. It comes quietly. It arrives with a smile. It begins when someone realizes that Rome's greatest strength isn't its legions or its generals. It's greed. And in North Africa, a young prince was already learning exactly how to exploit that weakness. Number 3. Jugurtha, Numidia, the king who bought Rome. It is 112 BC, and somewhere in a marble hall that echoes like a tomb, coins are clattering across the floor like metallic rain. Senators scramble to gather them, jeweled rings flashing in torchlight. They're basically crawling. Actual grown men with togas and authority down on their hands and knees, picking up gold like it's the archaeological find of their lives. Standing above them is a tall man with a half smile. His name is Jugurtha, and he is Prince of Numidia, a kingdom in North Africa across the sea from Rome. The man who was about to teach Rome the most brutal lesson in their entire history. Former Roman soldier and future architect of Rome's moral collapse. Here's the thing that makes Jugurtha absolutely terrifying. Hannibal made Rome afraid with swords and elephants. Jugurtha is going to make Rome afraid of itself. Jugurtha didn't wake up as a supervillain. He was trained for this by the best teacher money could buy. Rome. As a young warrior fighting beneath Roman banners at Numantia, he watched generals gamble with soldiers' pay. He saw bribes traded for glory like they were bread. Around campfires, he learned the most important lesson of his life. Rome's armor was discipline. Rome's weapons were steel. But Rome's actual joints were made of coin. When his adoptive father Micipsa died in 118 BC, Numidia, a kingdom in North Africa that Rome was basically keeping an eye on, was divided 3 ways. Nothing says smooth succession like splitting a country into thirds. Jugurtha got a piece, his cousins Adherbal and Hiempsal got the rest. Jugurtha smiled and got to work. Over the next decade, his strategy was methodical. Each year another city burned. Each year another rival vanished. He was an artist painting in blood and gold. Murder number 1 happened at Thermida during the first council of the 3 new rulers. Hiempsal insulted him. Jugurtha didn't forget. He catalogued it. He filed it away in the part of his brain reserved for revenge. That night, killers broke down Hiempsal's doors and dragged him from under his bed screaming, stabbing and strangling him in the courtyard, while servants watched in horror. Rome said nothing. Senators counted their coins and looked away. Because once you've accepted the first bribe, saying no to the second becomes awkward. Then came Adherbal. Smarter than his brother Hiempsal, he ran to Rome and begged for help. Roman senators listened and promised to send aid, but Jugurtha was already ahead of them. He sent gold to Rome. The senators took it, looked away, and Adherbal's pleas were forgotten. Jugurtha starved the city of Cirta for months. When Adherbal couldn't take it anymore, he surrendered under a promise of mercy. Jugurtha smiled and broke that promise immediately. Adherbal was dragged from the palace, stripped, beaten for hours, then impaled on a spear as the city burned around him. The massacre at Cirta finally made Rome do something. Italian and Roman traders had defended the city expecting mercy. Instead, every adult male was killed. Thousands of citizens and merchants had been cut down and piled at the gates like refuse. Sallust, a Roman historian who lived through these events, tells us the streets ran red. When dawn rose, the smoke hung so thick it seemed to have weight. Like the sky itself refused to move on. Only then did Rome stir. Not from outrage, but from panic. They'd been bribing the man murdering their own citizens, so they summoned Jugurtha to Rome under oath of safe conduct. He couldn't be touched. Rome's rules. Except his cousin Massiva was waiting in Rome, also petitioning for the Numidian crown. Jugurtha saw the problem. Within days, Massiva was stabbed to death in broad daylight near the Temple of Bellona in the middle of the Roman Forum. Witnesses saw everything, but Jugurtha had already paid off the right people. He bribed his way out of Rome and left the city. As he departed, he whispered something that would echo through history. Rome was a city for sale, and it was doomed when it found a buyer. Rome declared war. Jugurtha basically laughed in their face. He'd already learned Rome's greatest weakness. Swords were useless against corruption. He burned towns and slaughtered civilians like he was erasing them from history. Thousands were enslaved and marched across the desert in chains. His men salted the fields so nothing would ever grow again. They poisoned the wells. They drove prisoners in chains across burning sand like livestock being herded to slaughter, watching them drop one by one and just leaving them there. At the Muthul River in 109 BC, deep in North Africa near modern-day Algeria, Jugurtha set the perfect trap. A Roman army marched straight into it under a sun so relentless it felt like the gods themselves were angry. The ambush came from everywhere at once. Chaos, screaming, thirst so brutal that men were drinking their own blood. When it was over, the valley was basically a boneyard. Crows circled overhead, honestly quite pleased with their lunch options. Later that year, Jugurtha surrounded the Roman general Aulus Postumius Albinus, the entire army completely trapped with no water, no food, and no escape. Soldiers were literally dying of thirst standing next to their own commanders, watching officers argue about whose fault this was while the sand got hotter and their throats got drier. Then Jugurtha did something that would haunt Rome for generations. He forced them to pass under the yoke. Not a quick execution, not a clean defeat, a ritual humiliation. The yoke is a wooden beam balanced on 2 spears, and every conquered soldier has to bend down, crawl beneath it like an animal, submit to it completely. It's the ultimate symbol of total, absolute, complete defeat. It's saying, you are less than human. You are slaves. Jugurtha lined them up. Thousands of Roman soldiers. One after another, they had to crouch down and crawl through the dust beneath that wooden beam while Jugurtha watched. And he didn't just watch. He laughed. He laughed so hard his whole body shook. Because Rome, the empire that had conquered the world, was literally crawling through the dirt like dogs. For years, Rome kept losing. Generals kept failing. The Senate finally turned to someone different, Gaius Marius and his aide Sulla, a ruthless operator who understood that patience was sharper than any sword. Jugurtha had gold, but Sulla had something better: leverage. He met King Bocchus of Mauritania in torchlight. Sulla didn't just offer him a ring, he offered him power and Roman protection, recognition as a legitimate king. Bocchus could either stay allied with a hunted man, or he could betray him and gain Rome's favor. It didn't take long for Bocchus to decide. Jugurtha slept nearby that night, dreaming of triumph. At dawn, he woke in chains. The man who had taught Rome to accept bribes discovered that promises of power were worth far more than gold. In Marius's triumph, Jugurtha was paraded barefoot through Rome, gold chains cutting his wrists, bruised and defeated. He laughed once more. Rome was a city for sale, he said. This time nobody answered. They threw him into the Tullianum, Rome's worst prison. The air is foul. The stones are wet with centuries of blood. It's a tomb for the living. For 6 days he starved in the dark, gnawing at his own lips. Then silence swallowed him. And Rome thought it was done. But corruption doesn't die with one king. It spreads like plague. The senators who took Jugurtha's bribes taught the next generation how to sell the state piece by piece. Gold became the language of power. Bribery became policy. Rome had beaten him with Bocchus's betrayal. His own tactic turned against him. But the real damage was to Rome itself, because something was already stirring on the battlefields of southern Italy. Something that couldn't be bought or corrupted or reasoned with. Something that only understood war. And that something was riding towards Rome on horseback, leading war elephants through dust, about to teach the empire a lesson even more brutal than Jugurtha ever could. Number 4. Pyrrhus of Epirus, the victory that killed the victor. It is 280 BC, and somewhere on a plain in southern Italy, the ground is shaking under thunder that isn't coming from the sky. Bronze shields are ringing like bells. War elephants are surging through dust so thick you can taste it. And men are vanishing beneath them like they were never there at all. Horses rear in absolute panic. Spears snap like twigs. The Roman line folds like origami made of terrified soldiers. At the center of all this chaos rides Pyrrhus of Epirus, descendant of Achilles, radiant in gilt armor that catches the sun like he's personally been blessed by Apollo himself. His eyes are cold with calculation. He's not fighting. He's conducting a symphony of violence. And here's the thing that makes this story absolutely wild. He's going to win every single battle and lose absolutely everything. Let's talk about Pyrrhus's origin story, because it's honestly bonkers. He was born into chaos in 319 BC, exiled as an infant like some kind of Greek tragedy protagonist, crowned, and then betrayed before he turned 20. He lived as if destiny personally owed him blood as compensation for all that drama. He called his soldiers brothers, which sounds lovely and egalitarian, until you realize he then hurled them into storms of iron just to measure their worth. Like a really intense team-building exercise that ended in mass casualties. Fortune followed Pyrrhus everywhere, but only, it seems, to watch him fall. Like fortune was his personal stalker with a taste for irony. By his 30s, he ruled Epirus, which is in what's now northwestern Greece, and he dreamed of outshining Alexander the Great, which is a bit like saying you want to be more famous than Beyoncé. Good luck with that. Then came the call from Tarentum, a Greek city in southern Italy that was being threatened by Rome. They begged Pyrrhus for rescue. He saw more than duty. He saw empire. He saw his name carved in marble for eternity. He gathered about 30,000 men, 20 war elephants, and a heart burning for conquest like it had been set on fire by the gods themselves. His advisors warned him, Rome is no kingdom. Kings die once and stay dead, but republics are like zombies that just keep coming back like a nightmare you can't wake up from. Pyrrhus ignored them, obviously. The Battle of Heraclea in 280 BC was Rome's first introduction to what happens when you meet a tactical genius riding on pure ambition. The Roman legions advanced with the discipline of machines, shields locked, spears ready, absolutely confident in their formations because they'd been winning for decades. Then the ground began to tremble. Pyrrhus released his elephants. Their roar drowned out the Roman trumpets. Their weight shattered formations like they were made of paper. Riders vanished beneath stamping feet. Spears splintered against hide so thick it might as well have been armor. When silence finally fell, the river beside the field ran dark. Not from water, from blood mixed with mud and the absolute collapse of Roman confidence. Rome withdrew, bloodied and stunned. They had lost the field, but not the war. Already they were studying his methods, taking notes, planning revenge. For the first time in centuries, Rome had met something new, and it frightened them. Winter brought no peace. Pyrrhus walked among the graves of his own victories, reading the cost in silence. He counted his dead like a merchant counting losses, and the numbers were honestly horrifying. Then came the Battle of Asculum in 279 BC. Rome returned, absolutely relentless, like that friend who refuses to admit they lost the argument. For 2 days, the slaughter raged. Soldiers fought by torchlight when night refused to end it. Fires burned through the darkness, clearing ground for more battle. It was madness dressed up as strategy. When victory finally came, Pyrrhus's camp looked like a city of wounded, screaming, bleeding, dying. A friend congratulated him on his triumph. Pyrrhus looked at him and said only, "One more such victory, and I am undone." That line would echo through history. Pyrrhic victory, a win that costs so much it might as well be a loss. He had discovered something Rome already knew, but he was just learning. Rome could lose battle after battle and still not be beaten. They had endless reserves, endless stubbornness, endless capacity to just keep coming back. So Pyrrhus changed strategy. In 278 BC, he sailed to Sicily because the Greeks there were begging him to save them from Carthage. He drove out the Carthaginian armies. The Greeks cheered. Finally, a liberator. Then Pyrrhus started actually ruling, and it turned out he was absolutely terrible at it. He punished deserters. He stripped temples for cash. He ruled like a tyrant having a really bad day. The Greeks who had begged him to come now begged him to leave. Turns out freedom with Pyrrhus came with a side order of terror. Every triumph left him lonelier. He was so good at winning battles that he kept losing friends. It's honestly impressive in the worst possible way. By 275 BC, Pyrrhus returned to Italy for one more shot at glory. At Beneventum, he faced the Roman consul Manius Curius Dentatus, a general who had actually learned from Pyrrhus's previous victories. This time, the Romans chose their battlefield carefully. Narrow ground, tight spaces, terrible terrain for elephants. When Pyrrhus released his war elephants, they panicked. They couldn't maneuver in the cramped space. They couldn't charge properly. And in their terror, they turned around and stampeded straight back through Pyrrhus's own lines, crushing his soldiers like they were nothing. Pyrrhus watched his secret weapon destroy his own army. The same elephants that had terrified Rome at Heraclea were now his downfall. Irony meet battlefield. He retreated to Epirus, rich in trophies and war stories, poor in absolutely everything that actually mattered. He had conquered terror. But peace? Peace was the one enemy he could never defeat. And peace, it turns out, was the one thing he actually needed. The death of Pyrrhus in 272 BC is honestly one of history's most embarrassing endings for a military genius. He was in Argos, a city in Greece, getting involved in some pointless local power struggle, because apparently conquering half the Mediterranean wasn't enough drama for him. He was fighting through rain-soaked alleys at night, cutting down enemies and random bystanders alike. At this point, he'd completely lost the plot. Fires were spreading. Sparks were falling into puddles of oil. The whole scene was absolute chaos. Then, from a rooftop, an old woman looked down at this legendary warrior causing mayhem in her street. And she was not having it. She grabbed a roof tile and hurled it down at him. It struck his neck in that tiny gap between his helmet and his armor. The one vulnerable spot in all his fancy golden gear. Pyrrhus, descendant of Achilles, terror of Rome, conqueror of armies, was knocked unconscious by flying pottery. He fell, and an enemy soldier quickly finished him off. The man who had fought Rome fell to an angry grandmother with good aim. Honestly, you couldn't write a better cautionary tale if you tried. Pyrrhus became a word. Pyrrhic victory, a triumph that costs too much. Rome both feared and admired him because he was a tactical genius. His battlefield innovations, his use of elephants, his strategic brilliance were all studied by Roman generals for generations. They wished someone that talented had been fighting for Rome instead of against it. But here's the thing. His story also became Rome's favorite cautionary tale. He taught them that genius without restraint is its own destruction, that you can win every battle and still lose the war, that sometimes the greatest victory is knowing when to stop. Rome learned from both his brilliance and his failure, and that made them even more dangerous. But east of Greece another king was watching and learning, believing he could do what Pyrrhus could not. He believed he could command even death itself to obey, and his story would be written in poison. Number 5. Mithridates VI, Pontus, the Poison King. It is 120 BC, somewhere in northern Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, and a servant collapses on the marble floor. His breath is fading. His eyes are rolling back, and the young prince watching him doesn't flinch, doesn't call for help. He just calmly writes notes on a wax tablet like he's documenting a particularly interesting science experiment, which, honestly, he basically is. This prince had been training his body for years on measured doses of toxin. Arsenic, hemlock, nightshade. You know, the usual breakfast items for a completely normal royal teenager. He'd been building immunity, one careful dose at a time, until poison became less of a threat and more of a hobby. Beside the dying servant sits a silver cup of tainted wine. The prince picks it up, drinks it down, and smiles. His name is Mithridates VI, and he believed the only way to rule a poisoned world was to become completely immune to it, which is both genius and absolutely unhinged. Hannibal had terrified Rome with elephants and tactical genius. Jugurtha corrupted Rome with gold. But Mithridates was about to teach Rome a new kind of fear, the fear of chemistry wielded like a weapon. Let's talk about his origin story, because it reads like a revenge thriller written by someone who really hated their family. Mithridates was born around 135 BC and inherited the throne of Pontus as a boy after his father was murdered. Probably poisoned, ironically enough. The universe has a sense of humor. His mother ruled as regent, which sounds lovely and supportive until you realize she was actively trying to keep the throne for herself. Permanently, as in her son was more of an inconvenient detail than an heir. So Mithridates did what any rational teenager would do. He vanished into the wilderness of Pontus for 7 years. Not to find himself or go backpacking across Europe to discover his true calling. No, he lived with hunters in the mountains, testing venoms on animals, recording their effects with scientific precision that would honestly make modern researchers jealous. Oil lamps flickered over jars of herbs and bones. His ink-stained fingers documented each result like he was preparing a doctoral thesis titled How to Murder People with Plants, a comprehensive guide. When he finally returned, fluent in 20 languages and colder than marble, he dethroned his mother using the exact same poisoning methods she'd probably used to preserve her power. Poetic justice, really. Rome ruled by law and legions. Mithridates ruled by chemistry and absolutely terrifying dedication to his craft. Between 120 and 89 BC, Mithridates spent decades building an empire across the Black Sea coast. He dominated Pontus and stitched together alliances with Armenia, Colchis, and Cappadocia. These kingdoms were tied together not by friendship or trade agreements, but by pure, undiluted fear. His court was filled with spies. Courtiers later swore that a Roman envoy once left his presence with a hand blistered by poisoned ink, just from touching a letter. That's the level of commitment we're talking about here. Every banquet was an experiment. Every alliance was a test tube. Every guest was a potential data point in his ongoing research. When Rome's allies dined at his table, they drank wine. Sure, but never twice from the same cup. Because once you understood Mithridates' methods, you understood that survival meant paranoia. Trust no one, especially not the wine. But Mithridates wasn't satisfied with just personal immunity. His obsession spread from body to empire. If he could purge toxins from himself, why not purge them from his entire realm? And by toxins he meant Romans and Italians living in Asia Minor. He'd basically decided to Marie Kondo his empire, tidying up by throwing out anything that didn't spark joy. And Romans definitely didn't spark joy. One evening in 88 BC started like any other across Asia Minor. Lyres were playing in courtyards. Merchants were counting their day's earnings. Roman and Italian families were settling in for dinner, probably complaining about the local wine or whatever Romans complained about. It was peaceful, ordinary, boring even. But weeks earlier, Mithridates had sent secret letters to governors and officials across dozens of cities. The orders were chillingly specific. On this particular day, kill every Roman and Italian in your territory. Men, women, children, everyone. And when that day arrived, the massacre began simultaneously across the entire region. Doors burst open, armed men rushed in, knives flashed in the torchlight. It was coordinated genocide on a massive scale. By dawn, ancient sources claim between 80 and 150,000 Romans and Italians lay dead. Entire families, merchants, trading communities, all murdered in a single night. Entire merchant colonies just vanished like someone had taken an eraser to a map and rubbed until there was nothing left but smudges. The Aegean wind carried only smoke and the whisper of his name. Rome called it madness and genocide. Mithridates called it cleansing, like he was tidying up his empire and Romans were just clutter that needed removing. Historians now call this event the Asiatic Vespers, and it remains one of the largest coordinated massacres in ancient history. 3 wars followed. First against the Roman general Sulla, then against Lucullus, and finally against Pompey the Great. Mithridates' armies struck from mountains and sea, retreating only to strike again like a particularly vengeful boomerang that kept coming back angrier each time. Roman accounts claimed he spread disease intentionally, that he poisoned wells across the countryside, that he sent infected prisoners back through enemy lines like biological warfare wrapped in Roman tunics. Roman generals learned to fear his feasts more than his fortresses, because you could defend against a siege with walls and soldiers, but defending against a dinner invitation was significantly trickier. Do you say yes and risk poison, or say no and insult a king? Tough call. Even in defeat, Mithridates remained terrifying, because losing a battle just meant he'd retreat, regroup, and probably invent 3 new poisons while he was at it. But age and paranoia are a toxic combination, especially for someone whose entire life revolved around toxins. By 74 BC, Mithridates' genius had turned inward like a snake eating its own tail. He became convinced Rome had found a new poison that could bypass his immunity. So he tested antidotes on his own servants, because apparently ethics weren't part of his scientific method. The man was basically running unregulated human trials in his palace. His allies started deserting him. His sons rebelled. Even his closest advisors began quietly backing away from the paranoid king who saw poison in every shadow, every cup, every gift. He retreated to his fortress at Panticapaeum on the Black Sea, basically the ancient world's most fortified panic room. As Roman troops closed in for the final time, Mithridates faced his worst nightmare. He would be captured and paraded through Rome in chains as a trophy. He made a horrific decision. Rather than see his 2 youngest daughters suffer that fate, he would spare them the humiliation. He gave poison to his daughters Mithridates and Nyssa first. They drank it and died quickly. Then Mithridates drank what was left of the poison himself, expecting to follow them into death. But absolutely nothing happened. Years of taking small doses of poison to build immunity had worked too well. The poison that killed his daughters couldn't kill him. The man who had spent his entire life mastering death couldn't actually die when he needed to. The irony is honestly incredible. So as Roman soldiers hammered at his doors, he ordered a guard to do what venom could not. The guard drew his sword and killed him. Back in Rome, senators kept his famous antidote recipe locked in their homes for generations. They became just as paranoid as Mithridates had been, constantly afraid of poison in every drink, every meal, every gift from a friendly rival. Centuries later, the physician Galen still wrote about the Mithridatic antidote as the ultimate safeguard against poisoning. The recipe became legendary. Mithridates had proven that knowledge without mercy is its own disease. That genius twisted by paranoia becomes indistinguishable from madness. But his story also taught Rome something they'd been learning slowly from each of these brutal enemies. That fear doesn't just come from swords and armies charging over hills. Sometimes it comes from the food you eat, the wine you drink, the gifts you accept from smiling allies. Sometimes the deadliest weapon is invisible, and the most terrifying enemy is the one who's already inside your home. And soon, fear would no longer hide in laboratories and palaces. It would ride on horseback beneath banners of rebellion, screaming defiance across the misty forests of Gaul. Where a young warrior named Vercingetorix was about to forge a nation and teach Rome that unity could be just as deadly as any poison. Number 6. Vercingetorix, Gaul. The King of Fire. It is 52 BC, and somewhere in the misty forests of central Gaul, a young warrior is about to commit the most radical act of rebellion in Celtic history. Not by raising an army, not by storming a Roman fort, not even by ambushing a legion. No, Vercingetorix is going to do something absolutely mental. He's going to convince his own people to burn their homes to the ground, destroy their grain stores, and watch their villages turn to ash. And they're going to do it willingly. They're going to set fire to everything they own, because this tall, charismatic noble has somehow convinced them that freedom is worth the ruin of everything. His name is Vercingetorix, lord of the Arverni tribe, and he's about to unite the most famously disunited people in ancient Europe into something Rome has never seen before, a Gallic nation, which is a bit like herding cats, except the cats are heavily armed, deeply suspicious of each other, and have been feuding for generations over things like whose great-great-grandfather insulted whose great-great-grandmother at a feast in 200 BC. Let's talk about his origin story, because it's basically a masterclass in how to create a revenge-obsessed revolutionary. He was born around 82 BC into a noble family living under Rome's shadow. His father, Celtillus, tried to make himself king, which Rome had explicitly forbidden. Bad move. Celtillus was executed by his own tribe for that ambition, not by Rome. By fellow Gauls trying to stay on Rome's good side, which tells you everything about how terrified everyone was. Young Vercingetorix watched those flames, the reflection dancing in his eyes like the world's most traumatic formative memory. The kind that sends you straight into therapy or straight into revolutionary leadership. He chose option 2. He learned the most important lesson. Rome respected only fear, and Gaul had completely forgotten how to inspire it. So he waited. Through decades of Roman occupation, through Caesar's brutal campaigns that turned Gaul into an archaeological site where broken tribes wandered around asking, "Remember when we had things?" By 53 BC, Gaul was basically a graveyard with occasional survivors looking confused and defeated. Then winter came to Gergovia, the Arverni capital. Snow fell on the hair of tribal chieftains as Vercingetorix raised his sword before them and made them an absolutely wild proposition. He told them they could unite under his command, follow his strategy, and fight Rome properly for the first time. Or they could keep doing what they'd been doing, which was losing spectacularly while blaming each other in increasingly creative ways. From the Seine to the Auvergne, Tens of thousands answered his call. No Gaul had ever united them all before, and frankly, no Roman believed he could. The Romans thought Gauls were genetically incapable of cooperation, like it was a medical condition they'd inherited along with their love of elaborate moustaches. Turns out, all they needed was someone angry enough and charismatic enough to make them forget they hated each other more than they hated Rome. Then Vercingetorix unveiled his strategy, and even his own allies thought he'd absolutely lost his mind. As Caesar advanced through Gaul in 52 BC, Vercingetorix ordered his people to burn everything before the Romans could reach it. Grain stores, homes, entire towns, everything. Scorched earth policy, taken to its logical and absolutely terrifying extreme. No half measures, just complete, total destruction of everything they owned. Grain crackled like salt in the flames. Smoke became their flag. Children cried as their homes burned by their own parents' hands. It was apocalyptic. It was brutal. It was genius. Because here's the thing about Roman armies. They need supplies. They need food. They need shelter. They need resources. And if there are no supplies, Caesar's army would starve. It's the ancient equivalent of, if I can't have it, nobody can, except applied to an entire country. Only the wealthy city of Avaricum refused to destroy itself. The citizens begged Vercingetorix to spare their beautiful city, promising they could definitely defend it. Absolutely certain they'd be fine. Vercingetorix reluctantly agreed, though you could tell from historical accounts he knew exactly how this would end. Spoiler alert, not well. Caesar stormed Avaricum and killed nearly every single inhabitant. 40,000 people dead because they couldn't bear to burn their own city first. When one Gallic chief had the audacity to protest this loss, Vercingetorix struck him down in front of everyone. "So dies disobedience," he said calmly, and after that nobody questioned his burn everything to the ground policy again. Turns out public executions are quite effective for enforcing unpopular policies. Then came the moment that would define Vercingetorix's legend forever. Caesar marched on Vercingetorix's homeland, determined to crush the rebellion at its source and remind everyone who was in charge. At Gergovia, perched on a hill like a fortress designed by someone who really understood defensive geography and also really hated stairs, the Romans prepared for their usual victory. They scaled cliffs and walls, absolutely confident this would be another routine conquest to add to Caesar's growing collection. Instead, they were driven back in absolute panic. Standards fell. Legions broke. Men ran. Caesar lost nearly 700 legionaries, which by Roman standards was a catastrophic disaster worthy of a full-scale inquiry. Even Caesar, the man who literally wrote his own propaganda and made himself look good in every possible situation, admitted defeat and withdrew. "A lesson paid in blood," he later wrote, which is the ancient equivalent of a really passive-aggressive Yelp review. 1 star, would not recommend. For one heartbeat, Rome remembered what fear felt like. For one glorious moment, Gaul looked genuinely unbeatable. Vercingetorix had done what Hannibal did at Cannae. He'd made Rome bleed on its own terms, using its own tactics, on its own schedule. But Caesar was nothing if not relentlessly, obsessively, almost pathologically determined to win. He struck back with the kind of engineering project that makes you wonder if Romans were actually human or just very disciplined robots programmed to build things and conquer people. He trapped Vercingetorix's army in the hill fortress of Alesia and then did something absolutely bonkers. He built over 20 miles of fortification in just 3 weeks. Trenches, palisades, wooden towers. The whole Roman construction catalogue delivered at speed that would make modern contractors weep with envy. Then, because apparently that wasn't extra enough, he built a second wall behind the first one, encircling his own camp to block any rescue attempts from outside. Caesar literally built a wall to keep Vercingetorix in, and then built another wall to keep everyone else out. It's the ancient version of really committing to a project. Each night the walls crept closer. Each morning the sky filled with the sound of Roman hammers, which is possibly the most psychologically devastating soundtrack imaginable when you're trapped and starving. Inside Alesia, the starving Gauls ate their horses and prayed to gods who seemed to have taken an extended holiday and stopped answering calls. Outside, reinforcements gathered. Ancient sources claim up to 250,000 men surrounded Alesia, though modern historians say fewer because ancient sources loved to exaggerate. Either way, enough to darken the horizon like a particularly ominous weather system made of angry Gauls. For 2 days, thunder rolled across the fields as the relief army attacked Caesar's outer wall while Vercingetorix attacked from inside. It was the ultimate pincer movement, Rome trapped between two armies, exactly the situation they'd put so many others in, now experiencing it firsthand. Then silence. After the last arrow fell, after the last horn sounded, the only noise was wind moving through empty quivers and the labored breathing of exhausted men who'd just realized they'd lost. The outer army broke. They fled. They ran like they'd suddenly remembered they had important appointments literally anywhere else. And Vercingetorix, watching from the walls of Alesia, knew it was over. He waited one night before surrendering at dawn, giving his people time to process what was coming and maybe say their goodbyes. Then he rode from the gates on his black horse, armor polished to mirror brightness, head held high like he was attending a coronation instead of his own defeat. It was theatre, deliberate, dramatic theatre designed to be remembered. Before Caesar's tribunal, he dismounted slowly and with ceremony. He removed his sword with the kind of reverence you'd use for a sacred ritual and laid it at Caesar's feet. Caesar watched him with a face of stone, impassive, curious, almost respectful, like he was watching a particularly fascinating specimen in a museum who'd just done something unexpectedly dignified. The man who burned his entire world to keep it free now bowed before the fire he could not control. In chains, Vercingetorix was held for 6 years, which is quite a long time to sit in a cell thinking about how close you came to winning. Finally, in 46 BC, he was paraded through Rome during Caesar's triumph, while crowds roared and pointed at the great rebel in chains. He stood silent, proud, unbroken even in defeat, which honestly just made the whole spectacle more dramatic and memorable. When the parade ended, they led him beneath the Capitoline hill to the Tullianum, that same horrific prison that had swallowed Jugurtha decades before. The place where Rome sent people it wanted to forget. His death ended Gaul's freedom, but began its legend. Because sometimes defeat writes better stories than victory ever could. Here's what the story really means. Jugurtha bought Rome with gold, teaching it corruption. Mithridates tried to poison it with venom, teaching it paranoia, but Vercingetorix defied it with fire and unity, proving that even scattered tribes could become a nation if someone believed hard enough and was willing to burn absolutely everything to make it happen. His rebellion failed militarily, yes, but it showed Rome something genuinely terrifying. That resistance could be organized, that occupied peoples could unite, that freedom was an idea that burned hotter than any torch and couldn't be extinguished just by winning battles. Even Caesar, who conquered him and wrote extensively about how brilliant Caesar was at conquering things, would one day fall to assassins' knives. Proof that fear never ends. It only changes masters, like a particularly persistent ghost that refuses to move on and keeps rearranging your furniture. But before Vercingetorix ever burned his first village, before he ever united the Gallic tribes, Rome had already faced a different kind of nightmare. 20 years earlier, terror had risen from the most unexpected place imaginable, not from kings or princes or noble warriors with ancestral grudges, but from the empire's own slaves. Men with no crowns, no kingdoms, no armies, just chains, rage, and a leader who would make Rome question everything it believed about power. Number 7. Spartacus, Rome, the slave who defied an empire. It is 73 BC, and in the amphitheatre of Capua, just south of Rome, 2 men are fighting for their lives under a sun so bright it feels like it has a personal vendetta. Sunlight flashes on steel. One man falls, blood pooling in the sand like someone knocked over the wine at a really awkward dinner party. The other kneels, waiting for the signal to finish him off. The victor hesitates. Then he does something absolutely wild. He throws his sword aside, just chucks it, like he's quitting his job on live television. For a moment the crowd freezes, genuinely unsure if this is part of the entertainment or if they're witnessing history's first gladiatorial labor strike. Then guards rush in, chains rattle, and the whole place erupts into absolute chaos. That man is Spartacus. And from this exact moment, Rome's favorite Saturday night entertainment is about to become its worst nightmare. Let's talk about how Spartacus ended up in this mess, because his origin story is honestly heartbreaking. He was a Thracian from the Maedi tribe, which is in what's now Bulgaria. He'd once served in Rome's auxiliary cavalry, actually fighting for the empire. Then he got captured and sold into slavery. The irony is almost poetic in the worst possible way, like getting fired from a company and then being forced to work in their basement for free. Forever. He was trained as a gladiator in Capua's barracks. The smell of sweat and iron filled every breath. At night, he listened to chains scraping against stone like the world's most depressing ASMR playlist. He watched his comrades die for applause, each death feeding Rome's insatiable hunger for blood sport. It was like a reality TV show, except everyone actually died, and nobody won a cash prize. He'd seen the face of Rome up close, beautiful on the outside, absolutely merciless on the inside, addicted to violence like it was the empire's favorite recreational activity. One night in 73 BC, 78 men decided they'd had enough. They armed themselves with kitchen knives, cooking spits, and basically anything sharp they could get their hands on. Honestly, if you've ever wondered what desperate men can do with cutlery, this is your answer. They stormed the guards and fled into the darkness. Dogs barked. Bronze doors clanged like the world's angriest percussion section. Torches whipped in the wind as they ran for the hills. They seized wagons filled with gladiatorial weapons meant for the arena. Cleavers, short swords, the whole deadly inventory. It's like robbing a sporting goods store, except everything is designed specifically for murder. Spartacus was chosen as their leader, not because of birth or fancy titles, but because 77 desperate men looked at him and thought, yes, this is the person we trust with our lives. For the first time ever, slaves were obeying one of their own. Not a master, not a Roman, one of them. From the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, yes, that Vesuvius, the one that would later bury Pompeii like angry nature's greatest mic drop, Spartacus pulled off a trick worthy of legend. The Romans had trapped him on the mountain. They positioned their forces at the bottom and basically said, "We've got you now. Enjoy starving to death up there." Spoiler alert, they did not have him. Spartacus wove ropes from vines, lowered his men down a sheer cliff face like some kind of ancient special forces operation, and attacked the Roman force from behind. The Romans were annihilated, completely obliterated. The masters of the world had just been ambushed by their own escaped slaves using arts and craft supplies. Rome was stunned, horrified, slightly embarrassed. The hunters had become the hunted, and nobody knew quite how to process that information at the next Senate meeting. Within a year, Spartacus's army swelled to over 70,000 men. Runaway slaves, shepherds, deserters, basically anyone who'd had enough of Rome's nonsense, they all found a cause in his rebellion. It was like the world's angriest and most justified flash mob. Spartacus drilled them like proper soldiers. Fields turned into boot camps. Shepherds became spearmen. Their laughter echoed where legion drums once rolled. Praetors, which were basically high-ranking Roman officials who thought they were very important, were sent to crush him. They vanished in the valleys of southern Italy like they'd been deleted from existence. The rebellion had become an actual army, and Rome was starting to panic. For 2 years, from 73 to 71 BC, the revolt burned across Italy like a scar the empire couldn't heal. Spartacus possibly intended to cross the Alps and scatter his people home to freedom. His followers dreamed of liberty. He dreamed of simply surviving with dignity. But here's where things got messy. Raids turned towns to smoke. Greed began to poison the purity of their cause. Freedom had united them, but greed, that universal human weakness that ruins literally everything, began to tear them apart. The Senate panicked like a group of politicians, realizing they'd massively, catastrophically underestimated a problem. They recalled Pompey from Spain, where he'd been fighting other wars, and they gave command in Italy to Crassus, one of Rome's richest men and possibly one of history's pettiest generals. Crassus took this very personally. He had extreme wealth, wounded pride, and an absolute determination to prove he was just as militarily brilliant as everyone else thought they were. He built trenches and ramparts, 50 miles of fortification in just 3 weeks. He was literally trying to cage the rebellion with walls like it was some kind of ancient containment protocol. Spartacus broke through once, but the dream was dying. In the rebel camps, captains started fighting each other over stolen loot. Spartacus watched in silence, then separated them without a word. They had defeated Rome's legions, professional soldiers, trained killers, but they couldn't defeat themselves and their own greed. Honestly, the most tragically human story of all time. By 71 BC, near the Silurus River in Lucania, Spartacus was surrounded. Trapped, outnumbered. Any reasonable person would have surrendered or fled. Spartacus refused. He killed his own horse before his men, saying something that would echo through history. "If I win, I shall have many more horses. If I lose, I won't need one. It's the ancient world's equivalent of burning your ships, except more personal and involving a really expensive horse." The final battle roared like thunder. Iron met iron. Horses screamed, dust blinded the sky. The air became thick with sweat and the metallic tang of blood and absolute terror. Spartacus fought toward Crassus himself, cutting through shield walls with the desperate fury of a man who knew this was his last stand. Then he vanished beneath a wave of Roman soldiers. No one saw him actually fall, only the tide of bodies closing over the man who had once made the entire empire tremble. The aftermath was brutal even by Roman standards, which is honestly saying something. 6,000 prisoners were crucified along the Appian Way, one cross every 40 paces from Capua to Rome. It took days to complete. Crows drifted from cross to cross like they'd won the lottery. Travelers whispered prayers and tried very hard not to look up. Pompey's legions arrived soon after the battle, slaughtered about 5,000 fleeing rebels, and then Pompey claimed credit for ending the entire rebellion. Because of course he did. Nothing says military glory like showing up after someone else did all the work and taking a bow. Crassus was furious, but Pompey had better PR. Rome called it justice. Others called it fear, dressed up in official robes and pretending to be civilization. Spartacus left no empire, no monuments, no treasure buried somewhere for archaeologists to find 2,000 years later. He only left a question that would haunt Rome forever. What will people endure for freedom? Rome thought the crosses would silence that question. That the sheer horror of 6,000 crucifixions would teach everyone a lesson about obedience. Instead, they marked the mileposts of an idea that wouldn't die. Every cross a reminder that even slaves could make an empire bleed. Spartacus proved something Rome desperately didn't want anyone to believe. That power isn't permanent. That even the most oppressed people can rise up. That rebellion isn't just possible, it's inevitable when you push human beings too far. His story became a symbol, not of victory, because he didn't win, but of resistance, of the radical idea that some things are worth fighting for even when you know you'll probably lose. Rome's victory bought them no peace, only the memory of fear marching beside every legion for generations. And centuries later, far beyond Rome's eastern borders in Persia, a ruler would rise who would do to emperors what Rome once did to slaves. His name was Shapur I, King of Kings, and he would take Rome's pride and drag it through the dust in golden chains. Number 8, Shapur I, Persia, the emperor's captor. It is the year 260 AD, and somewhere near Edessa in northern Mesopotamia, the desert is shimmering like molten glass under a sun so brutal it feels personal. The air ripples with heat. Sand hisses under iron hooves. The world smells like dust, sweat, and impending doom. Roman banners tremble in the scorching wind. Legions wait, exhausted and half-blind beneath that merciless sun, probably wondering whose brilliant idea it was to schedule a battle in what is essentially a giant oven. On the horizon rides a figure that makes even hardened Roman scouts go completely still. He's crowned in turquoise and gold. His horse is armored from head to hoof like it's wearing a very expensive and slightly excessive outfit. Even from a distance, he doesn't look like a man. He looks like a moving statue made of pure wealth and divine authority. His name is Shapur I, King of Kings of the Sasanian Empire. This is basically the ancient Persian way of saying, I'm the boss of all the other bosses, thank you very much. Before the day ends, a Roman emperor is going to kneel before him in the dust. An actual emperor, on his knees, in front of a Persian king. For centuries, Rome had made other kings bow and beg, and generally grovel in very undignified ways. Today, a king will make an emperor crawl, and the entire ancient world is about to lose its collective mind. Let's rewind a bit and talk about how Shapur became this terrifying. He was the son of Ardashir I, founder of the Sasanian dynasty, which sounds impressive because it absolutely was. Ardashir had rebuilt Persian power from the ashes of centuries of decline. But Shapur inherited more than just a throne. He inherited a prophecy that he would restore Persia's ancient glory and eclipse even Alexander the Great's empire. No pressure whatsoever. For every city Rome had burned over the centuries, Shapur built one of stone and fire. He reorganized his armies with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that would make a project manager weep with joy. He forged cataphracts, which were heavily armored cavalry that looked like tanks on horseback. He built siege engines that could rival Rome's best engineering. On his coins, next to his face, gleamed the words, King of Kings, beside the sacred flame of Ahura Mazda, the Persian god of light and wisdom. He didn't see himself as just another mortal ruler playing politics. He saw himself as divine balance to Rome's pride, the universe's way of keeping Rome humble, which Rome was about to discover in the most humiliating way possible. The first clash came between 243 and 244 AD, when Emperor Gordian III marched east with what Roman propaganda claimed was 200,000 men. Honestly, Romans loved exaggerating their army sizes like they were trying to win a "who has the biggest legion" contest. Dust rose for hours before the charge began. When it finally settled after the battle near Mysice on the Euphrates, near modern-day Fallujah, nobody was quite sure which army was still standing. Spoiler alert, it was Shapur's. Gordian fell. The Romans fled in absolute panic. Shapur erected a monument at Nakhche Rustam, showing the fallen emperor beneath his horse, which is the ancient equivalent of posting your victory on Instagram with maximum pettiness. The East had remembered its strength, and Rome was starting to realize they might have underestimated their Persian neighbors by, about a catastrophic amount. Then came the Second War between 252 and 256 AD, and Shapur swept west like a particularly vengeful weather system made of swords and fire. He captured cities across Syria and Cilicia with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning this revenge tour for quite a while. Antioch, Rome's jewel of the East, the glittering cosmopolitan capital where wealthy Romans went to show off their culture and sophistication, fell in fire and absolute panic. Roman chroniclers later wrote, in horrified detail, that a child hid beneath a bronze statue during the siege. By dawn, both the child and the statue had melted into the same silver puddle. It's the kind of detail that makes you realize just how hot those fires burned, and how completely Antioch was destroyed. Survivors were paraded in chains through Persian streets, while Romans back home tried very hard not to think about what was happening to their fellow citizens. Where Rome once ruled with absolute authority, Persia was now performing its revenge in bronze, flame, and deeply intentional humiliation. Rome sent a new emperor to fix this disaster. His name was Valerian, and he was old, cautious, and honestly quite weary from dealing with plague outbreaks that had been ravaging the empire. Not exactly the energetic young conqueror Rome desperately needed right now. At Edessa, disease and thirst crippled his legions before the battle even properly started. Shapur watched, waited, and then struck from three sides like a tactical genius who'd been studying Roman weaknesses for homework. Roman trumpets fell silent. The emperor's white cloak, which should have been gleaming and pristine, darkened with dust and probably regret. His horse reared in panic and threw him. The Roman lines didn't just break. They shattered into thousands of pieces like someone had dropped a very expensive vase. Valerian, Emperor of Rome, master of the known world, was captured alive. The first Roman emperor in history to be taken prisoner by an enemy. The unthinkable had happened. In his own inscription at Nakhche Rustam, Shapur boasted with absolutely zero humility, "I captured Valerian with my own hands and made him kneel." The eagle wasn't just wounded. The eagle was in chains, and everyone was watching. Each morning, former Emperor Valerian was brought before the Persian court to kneel. Each evening his chains grew heavier, though no metal was actually added. It was psychological warfare perfected to an art form. Persian legend tells that Shapur would mount his horse by stepping on the emperor's back, using a Roman emperor as a footstool, the ultimate power move in ancient humiliation tactics. Some Roman writers claimed his skin was later stuffed and displayed in a Persian temple as a trophy. Others said he died in bondage and was buried somewhere in Persia. Persian records remain mysteriously silent on the exact details, which honestly just makes it more haunting. Either way, Valerian vanished into legend, and for Rome, this humiliation was somehow worse than death. Because death ends. But memory carved in stone lasts forever. Within a few years of Valerian's fall, Shapur ordered artisans to carve his triumph into a cliff at Naqsh-e-Rustam, beside the tombs of ancient Persian kings. The relief shows Shapur on horseback, radiating power, Valerian kneeling before him in defeat, another Roman emperor grasping Shapur's hand in surrender. Even now, 2,000 years later, at dusk when the sun slides across those cliffs, the carvings seem to breathe. The horse's eye looks alive in the shifting shadows. The kneeling emperor looks eternally defeated. Empires fall and crumble into dust. But stone? Stone endures, telling the same story over and over to anyone who'll listen. Shapur's victories stretched the Sasanian Empire from the Euphrates to Central Asia. Tradition says he founded a city for his Roman captives, the seed of Jundi Shapur, which would become a cradle of learning. Rome eventually recovered under Emperor Aurelian, but the scar remained. The invincible empire had bled in the desert dust, and everyone knew it. Shapur proved that even emperors could be conquered. That humiliation is the slowest poison, seeping into an empire's memory and never quite fading. The shame Rome felt in the east would eventually return from the west, but differently this time. Not as organized armies, but as thunder rolling across the plains, as hoofbeats like drums shaking the earth itself. Because beyond Persia's borders, far across the endless steppes, something was stirring, a force that would make even Rome's nightmares flee in terror, a rider who would be called the Scourge of God. His name was Attila, and he was coming. Number 9, Attila the Hun, the Scourge of God. It is the late 440s AD, and somewhere beyond the Danube frontier, the sky is bruising purple over endless plains that stretch to the horizon. Ravens rise screaming into smoke from burning villages. The smell of burning hay hangs in the air, mixing with the hiss of arrows and the low drum of hooves rolling like thunder that won't stop coming. Riders cross the horizon. Small at first, like dots on a map. Then countless. So many that the ground itself begins to tremble beneath them. At their head rides a man in plain leather armor, deliberately understated, his sword rusted with age, yet somehow worshipped as divine by his followers. His name is Attila, and to his enemies across Europe he is known by a title that still sends chills down spines 15 centuries later, the Scourge of God. By the late 40s, the Balkans are already burning. Within 4 years, even Gaul will be ablaze. Rome, which has survived Hannibal's elephants, Arminius's forests, and Spartacus's rebellion, is about to face something completely different. Not kings or rebels or brilliant tactical geniuses. The literal end of the world on horseback. Let's rewind and talk about how the Huns even arrived in Europe, because their origin story is honestly terrifying. Starting around 370 AD, the earth shook with mass migrations. The Huns came from somewhere in the Central Asian steppes, though historians still argue about exactly where. What we do know is they drove everyone westward like a catastrophic game of dominoes. First the Alans fled, then the Goths, then the Vandals. Each group running in absolute terror from these horsemen who appeared from nowhere. The Goths were so desperate they actually begged Rome for shelter. Rome, of all places. The empire they'd been fighting for centuries. That's how terrifying the Huns were. Your mortal enemy suddenly looks like a safe haven. From the endless grasslands came riders who lived, slept, and died in the saddle. They moved like smoke across the plains, appearing where no road led. No one knew where they came from originally, only that they never, ever stopped coming. Attila rose to power in 434 AD alongside his brother Bleda as joint rulers of the Huns. Together they immediately started demanding gold from the Eastern Roman Empire, calling it tribute for peace. Spoiler alert, the peace never lasted. Then in 445 AD, Bleda died under mysterious circumstances. The chroniclers suspected murder, but were too terrified to write it outright, probably because accusing Attila of fratricide seemed like a spectacularly bad idea for one's continued existence. Attila spent one night drinking alone after his brother's death. By morning, he ruled the entire Hun Empire by himself. Suspicious timing, really. He rebuilt his camp into a moving capital of wood and iron, where Roman envoys had to bow before a barbarian king. He had no palaces, no marble temples, no grand monuments. Yet emperors kept sending him treasure like he was running a very successful protection racket. Which, honestly, he basically was. Between 441 and 447 AD, Attila struck like lightning across the Balkans in what can only be described as a terror campaign with excellent logistics. Cities burned: Margus, Naissus, Singidunum. Their walls turned to rivers of ash. After the flames came something worse than destruction: silence. Whole towns were erased so completely there wasn't a single survivor left. Roman chroniclers wrote in horror about bones bleaching along the roads and wolves getting noticeably fatter on all the available corpses. It reads like the apocalypse, except it actually happened. Even Constantinople, the great eastern capital, trembled behind its massive walls. The emperor looked at his treasury, looked at Attila's army, and decided gold was cheaper than fighting. Attila didn't conquer cities in the traditional sense. He erased them, like someone took a very aggressive eraser to the map and just rubbed until there was nothing left. When the Eastern Empire's gold finally ran dry, Attila turned west toward Gaul. As he crossed the Rhine, the earth literally shook beneath thousands of hooves. This wasn't an exaggeration. When that many horses move together, you can feel it. Churches emptied. Mothers grabbed their children and fled into the woods. Refugees clogged every Roman road. Attila led an army of nations: Huns, Goths, Alans, Scythians. They were bound together not by loyalty or shared culture, but by pure, undiluted fear. Villages vanished at the mere mention of his name. People heard Attila was coming and just preemptively abandoned their homes, which saved him the trouble of burning them down himself. At Orleans in 451 AD, he finally met serious resistance. The combined forces of Rome and the Visigoths under General Aetius and King Theodoric decided they'd had quite enough of this invasion nonsense. For the first time in centuries, Rome wasn't fighting to expand its empire or protect its honor. Rome was fighting for basic survival. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 AD was absolutely massive. The plain thundered with hooves, war cries, and the sound of iron on iron. Attila's horsemen swept like wind across the battlefield. The Romans and Goths stood like walls, refusing to break. It was unstoppable force meeting immovable object. The battle raged until dusk. The field turned to mud, then blood, then eventually silence. King Theodoric fell during the fighting. Attila watched the old Visigoth king die in the rain and smiled, because apparently he was that kind of person. But here's where it gets interesting. Aetius, the Roman general, deliberately held back from pursuing Attila's retreating forces. Why? Because he was more afraid of the Visigoths becoming too powerful than of Attila escaping. Attila withdrew, undefeated but denied his victory. Even thunder can break upon a mountain, it turns out. The next year, in 452 AD, Attila decided Italy looked inviting and invaded. Aquileia burned so hot its stones cracked from the heat. Cities fell silent before his approach. Refugees fled to coastal lagoons, building temporary shelters that would eventually become Venice. Imagine being so terrifying that you accidentally create one of the world's most beautiful cities. Rome waited, completely undefended and absolutely terrified. Pope Leo, in an act of either incredible bravery or complete desperation, rode out alone to meet Attila. Just the Pope, some attendants, and a whole lot of faith. Witnesses later swore they saw a figure in white light beside Pope Leo. Others said it was Saint Peter and Saint Paul appearing with flaming swords. More skeptical historians suggested it was fever and good negotiating. Whatever happened, Attila turned back. Not from mercy, but from something. Mystery, fever, divine intervention, take your pick. In the spring of 453 AD, Attila took a new bride, a young woman named Ildico. That night there was feasting, laughter, and enough wine to float a small boat. Outside his tent, warriors sang and celebrated. Inside, the torches flickered once and went out. By morning, Attila the Hun, Scourge of God, terror of Europe, was dead. Blood flowing from his nose as if he'd drowned in his own lungs during the night. Some whispered poison, others suggested vengeance. Maybe it was just a severe nosebleed. We'll never know for certain. On the Pannonian plain near the Tisa River, his followers buried him in secret. Triple coffins of iron, silver, and gold. Then they killed all the slaves who dug the grave so no one could ever find it. The Scourge of God was buried by his own shadow nymph. His sons immediately started fighting and killing each other, which is what happens when your succession plan is basically survival of the fittest. His empire vanished into dust within a generation. The Huns scattered like smoke, disappearing from history almost as quickly as they'd appeared. For Rome, his death felt like salvation, divine intervention. But within another generation, the Western Roman Empire itself would collapse. The echo of hooves would fracture into dozens of barbarian kingdoms across Europe. Attila proved that even terror dies eventually, but its echo never fades. Every empire since has heard phantom hoofbeats in their nightmares, remembering that power is temporary, but fear of collapse is eternal. Yet before Attila's destruction, before chaos consumed everything, there was something Rome built worth remembering. Before we understand how empires end, we must understand how they learn to endure. And to see that, we must travel back in time to meet the Roman who taught his empire not just how to conquer, but when to stop. The man who defeated Hannibal not through matching his cruelty, but through exceeding his brilliance. The man who proved that Rome's greatest strength wasn't destruction, it was discipline. Number 10. Scipio Africanus, the Redeemer of Rome. It is 146 BC, and the city of Carthage is burning. Columns of fire rise like the ghosts of empires. The heat is so intense you can feel it from miles away. Ash falls like snow that will never melt. Among the ruins stands a Roman general, watching his enemy's final breath. He's young, powerful, absolutely victorious. But instead of celebrating, he whispers something that will echo through the centuries. A day will come when Rome will fall, as Carthage falls today. His name is Scipio Aemilianus, grandson by adoption of the man we're about to meet. The man who taught Rome not just how to conquer, but how to win without becoming a monster in the process. That ancestor's name was Publius Cornelius Scipio, but history remembers him as Scipio Africanus, the man who defeated Hannibal, the general who saved Rome when Rome had basically given up on saving itself. And here's the wildest part. He did it not through cruelty or fear or poisoning his enemies' wine at diplomatic dinners. He did it through something Rome was genuinely terrible at: restraint. Let's rewind to when young Scipio was growing up, because his origin story is honestly heartbreaking. His father and uncle had both died in Spain fighting Hannibal's armies. The family business was basically die heroically trying to stop Carthage, which is a tough legacy to inherit. By his mid-20s, Rome was still reeling from Cannae, that catastrophic battle where 50,000 Romans died in a single afternoon. Nobody wanted to take command in Spain. It was a death sentence with excellent benefits that you'd never live to collect. Scipio stepped forward at age 25 and said, quite simply, "If none will go, I will." Which is either incredibly brave or spectacularly stupid. Possibly both. The soldiers themselves chose him to lead, not the Senate, because sometimes democracy happens in the weirdest ways. They swore to follow him because destiny seemed to walk beside him like a loyal dog that happened to be excellent at military strategy. Where others saw disaster and inevitable death, Scipio saw the shape of victory hiding in the chaos. He was the ancient world's most optimistic tactical genius. His Spanish campaign between 211 and 206 BC was basically a masterclass in how to win friends and influence people, while also conquering them. At dawn, mist lifted over the harbor of New Carthage on Spain's southeastern coast. Scipio's ships slid in silent as predators. The attack came from sea and land simultaneously, which the defenders were absolutely not expecting. The city fell in a single day. One day. That's faster than most people can assemble flat-pack furniture. Here's where Scipio did something radical that made absolutely no sense to traditional Roman generals. He freed the hostages he'd captured. He spared prisoners. He treated even his enemies with actual human dignity. It was revolutionary. Rome's usual policy was conquer them, enslave them, salt their fields, maybe set something on fire for dramatic effect. Scipio's policy was conquer them, treat them like humans, win their loyalty, then profit. He won over tribes that Rome had never controlled, not through fear, but through the genuinely novel concept of not being terrible to people. Wild stuff. Roman commanders back home were baffled. Where was the brutality? Where were the mass executions? Where was the traditional Roman flair for dramatic violence? Scipio was basically playing a completely different game while everyone else was still reading the old rulebook. Finally, in 204 BC, the Senate gave him command to face Hannibal directly. This was it. The student versus the master. The young Roman who'd studied every one of Hannibal's tactics versus the man who'd terrorized Italy for 16 years. Scipio sailed to North Africa, drawing Carthage into its final desperate stand on their home turf. The two armies met somewhere on the plains near Zama in 202 BC. Dust rose. Elephants thundered. Two of history's greatest military minds stared at each other across the battlefield. Before the fighting started, Scipio and Hannibal met face to face. Two men who understood each other so completely they spoke like mirrors having a conversation. They discussed terms, peace, survival, the future. But in the end, steel had to answer steel. When Carthage released their war elephants, expecting them to shatter Roman lines like they had so many times before, Scipio did something brilliant. He ordered his ranks to part, creating empty lanes. The elephants charged through nothing, finding no Romans to trample, just empty space and confusion. Then Roman cavalry surrounded them from behind. It was Hannibal's own tactic, the one he'd used at Cannae to crush Rome, now turned against him with surgical precision. When the dust finally settled, Carthage was broken. Not because Rome had more soldiers or better equipment, but because Scipio had learned from the master and somehow exceeded him. Rome's 16-year nightmare ended on those plains. Rome's fear died that day. But so did something else. Rome's innocence. Because once you've learned how to defeat genius with genius, you can't unknow it. Once you've tasted victory through discipline rather than just overwhelming force, you're a different empire entirely. Back in Rome, crowds roared Scipio's name until their throats were raw. He could have demanded anything. Absolute power. Kingship. A crown made of solid gold and the tears of his enemies. Instead, he looked down from the speaker's platform, then turned away. The Senate offered him triumphs and authority beyond law. They wanted to make him essentially dictator for life because, hey, he'd just saved the entire empire from Hannibal. Seemed fair. Scipio refused it all. Every single honor, every bit of power. He just said no thank you and went home. Years after his triumph, when jealous political rivals accused him of theft and corruption, which is what happens when you're more successful than everyone else, Scipio's response was legendary. He grabbed the financial ledgers they wanted to examine and tore them to pieces in front of the Senate. Then he said, quite calmly, "Let us give thanks to the gods, for this is the anniversary of the day I defeated Hannibal at Zama." Mic drop. Ancient style. He left Rome for voluntary exile, genuinely disgusted by the greed and backstabbing politics. He'd saved the empire, and they thanked him with corruption charges and petty jealousy. In exile near Liternum, he still trained soldiers, wrote letters to friends, and dreamed of a Rome that could stay uncorrupted by its own success. He died in solitude around 183 BC. Ancient writers recorded that his tomb bore words that would haunt Rome forever. Ingrata patria ne ossa quidem mea habes. Ungrateful fatherland, you do not even have my bones. But his name endured in ways he never could have imagined. His tactics, his discipline, his restraint, they all became the foundation Rome built its future on. Through the writings of the historian Polybius, Scipio's strategies shaped generations of Roman generals, including Julius Caesar himself. He proved that true conquest isn't just destruction. It's knowing when to stop, when to show mercy, when to turn enemies into allies, rather than corpses. As the ashes of ancient empires settle across the centuries, as the echo of marching feet fades into the Mediterranean surf, one truth remains carved in stone and memory. Empires are born in conquest. That's the easy part. Any warlord with enough soldiers can conquer. Any general with enough cruelty can inspire fear. But empires survive through discipline, through knowing when the battle is won and the killing should stop, through understanding that true power isn't just taking what you want, it's knowing what to do with it once you have it. Rome learned this from Scipio Africanus, not through speeches or philosophy, but through his example, through watching him defeat the greatest general of the age and then walk away from unlimited power. And when the world trembles again, when new empires rise and fall, when history repeats itself in different costumes, but the same essential drama, somewhere in the dust, a voice will whisper, "Remember Scipio. Remember that the greatest conqueror Rome ever knew was the one who understood that victory without restraint is just another form of defeat. Sleep well, dear dreamer, knowing that even in humanity's darkest hours, in the bloodiest battles and most brutal conflicts, there have always been those rare few who chose wisdom over vengeance, discipline over destruction, and restraint over unlimited power. The fires of conquest still burn across history, but they burn brightest not in destruction, but in the light of those who knew when to let them die.